Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. With the excitement that exists around the newly announced skill Reap that's going to be joining the game in the Ultimatum League, so with the 3.14 release, I thought I'd do some initial theory crafting upon one possible way you could build around this skill. Now, very important disclaimer. One, this is not a full build. The patch notes are not out yet, so we don't know all of the details of what's going to change, and this is based upon were we to build around Reap as it existed, but in the 3.13 version of the game. So the skill may actually be terrible, and we can't tell this yet. I did some early theory crafting on the skill Crackling Lance when it was announced in the Heist League, and that turned out to be a very disappointing gem. So if you are going to go with this, then I would strongly suggest that you have a backup plan. However, because we're talking about playing it on an Elementalist here, there's lots of backup plans. The Elementalist is one of the most versatile ascendancies in the game right now, so assuming it's not gutted by patch note nerfs, you could definitely league start with this, and if it turns out Reap is terrible, then you could change it to a different skill. Secondly, this is not a complete build guide. It's not aimed at newer players. It's more some directions for theory crafting aimed at intermediate and advanced players that want to design their own build. If you're looking for full information, then come back closer to the launch of the Ultimatum League, and at that point I will endeavour to try to put up a full version of a Reap build, assuming that I'm still happy with the core concepts once the 3.14 patch notes are available, and that should be probably on the Thursday or Friday of this week, depending upon your time zone. Okay, so let's quickly talk about Reap, how it works, and what we want to do. So you can see here a graphic of it being used in the Path of Exile Ultimatum trailer. Ultimately, even though it looks like you are attacking with a scythe, you are not attacking. This is a spell that conjures an ethereal weapon that hits all sorts of enemies near you. In that way, it's more mechanically similar to the existing skill Ethereal Knives than any other skill in the game. However, it's not just like Ethereal Knives. So it conjures a bloody scythe that swings across an area, applying strong initial hit damage and also inflicting physical damage over time. With each swing, it gains a charge that scales its damage up and increases its life cost. And these charges are lost when Reap kills an enemy. So these are basically going to be available when you're fighting a single target, but they're not going to be reliably available when you're clearing. This increases its damage, but it also increases Reap's life cost. Note they're saying life cost here. Reap is a skill that you pay for with life rather than mana. I know it's one of the other strengths of the Elementalist that we're going to be talking about, is that the Elementalist has a lot of increased effect of Stone Golem, which will help you recover the life that you're spending casting this spell. It's particularly potent against single target enemies. Now, actually, my reading of this skill is that it's going to be most potent, it's going to be at its best when you are fighting multiple tough enemies simultaneously. So, for instance, more so than thinking of this as a single target skill, I think of this as something that will be great when you're fighting two of the Breach Lords in the Maven's Invitation, the Hidden, where you've got two Breach Lords attacking you simultaneously, and Reap is there hitting both of them and inflicting a powerful physical damage over time effect on them both, which is something that I think you can use really well here. So that's my initial thoughts on the skill, and the best ways to scale a physical damage over time effect at the moment is a combination of a few things. Firstly, a generic plus percentage damage or plus % spell damage due to some of Reap's unique mechanics. So let's talk quickly about those unique mechanics. And sorry about the blurry quality here. This has been a screen cap that's been taken from the Ultimatum trailer because that's the only image of the Reap skill gem that we have. And you'll see here, modifiers to spell damage apply to this skill's damage over time effect. So this means that any source of generic damage on your character and also any source of spell damage on your character is going to increase the amount of damage over time that you're doing. As well as that, various support gems that increase the skill's initial damage will also increase its damage over time effect. So, the other thing that you want though is the stat physical damage over time multiplier. Now this is a fairly tricky stat to source, and the best source of it at the moment is, generally speaking, cluster jewels. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the sorts of cluster jewels you might want to consider. So actual damage per second is basically the base damage from the gem multiplied by 100% plus all damage over time multiplier sources that apply to the skill, multiplied by 100% plus all spell damage, spell generic or damage over time sources that are increases. So things like increased spell damage on a caster wand, multiplied by all of the more multipliers that you can cram in from support gems, and multiplied by all more multipliers from effects that apply to the enemy, such as shock, maim, any effect that causes the enemy to suffer more damage. So Elementalist as an ascendancy gives us a lot of the third part of that product. So that's the increases and reductions to spell, generic, and damage over time sources are basically almost for free, and lets us easily shock enemies to help with the last phase of that multiplication as well. Now, some of the bleed damage over time multiplier nodes that exist on the passive tree will change to physical.multi, but we don't know which ones yet. And so for the moment, I just want to sketch a bit of an outline as to what you might do without considering that, and then we'll obviously reassess that once we get the 3.14 passive tree. So medium cluster jewels are sorry, I've just got Soul Rend there because I expect Soul Rend will have very similar damage to it. Medium cluster jewels are what we want to think about here because they are the missing piece. They offer the physical.multi or generic.multi that is hard to get from other sources. Now, there's a baseline 4% .multi that is on every small node that's granted by a medium cluster jewel. Additionally, there's access to a couple of particularly juicy ones. That's not one of them. Exposure therapy being one, 10% to damage over time multiplier. Now that replaces your 4% that you'd get, that replaces the baseline 4%, but it's still an improvement. Likewise, you have Brush with Death, which is the most powerful of these nodes, 10% .multi, and also some pretty nice little recovery effects as well. Ultimately, what I think we want on a medium cluster jewel, a perfect medium cluster jewel for this build, would have both Brush with Death and Exposure Therapy on it, and would have just whatever suffixes are useful. But if you can't get that, you could instead get one of these two and combine it with the effect either Potent or Powerful, which are rolls that come up here that increase the effect of the small passive skill nodes. So either 25%, which is easily available, and 35%, which is very much only available on endgame, very extreme endgame cluster jewels. So ideally, you're going to want to have any two of those. That is your Brush with Death, your Exposure Therapy, and Potent or Powerful. That's going to set you up with a decent cluster jewel. I think you may want to consider having 4 medium cluster jewels in your build. So that means that you'd have 2 large cluster jewels that each have 2 medium cluster jewels in them. But you may also wish to consider just using one large cluster jewel with 2 mediums off it. Or maybe you will just put medium cluster jewels directly into the outer section of your tree. The reason that you might do that, just having the medium cluster jewels, is because the large cluster jewels, I've got to say, are disappointing. The options here don't really support a Reap build very well. You can increase spell damage, but the only really solid thing here is probably Arcane Heroism, maybe, for when you're fighting a single target enemy. You'll eventually get Arcane Surge up, which is a more multiplier to your spell damage. That's pretty good, but you can also get Arcane Surge via other means, such as using Arcane Cloak linked to Arcane Surge support. And so I don't think that this is irreplaceable, and it's just not all that strong, given that you're going to need to allocate several nodes to use a large cluster jewel properly. There's also a couple of things that will add some damage and will add some spell block, which is useful, but is not overwhelmingly powerful or anything like it. So large cluster jewels are there. There's something you might want to consider, and that would be what the increased spell damage option is. The other option that you may want to consider involves the node Spiritual Aid on the passive tree. Spiritual Aid causes all increases and reductions to minion damage that your character has to also apply to your own damage, which means that it'll scale up the physical damage of Reap and also the damage over time effect of Reap. In order to do this, in order to do this, you're going to need to allocate Spiritual Aid, which may not be in a good spot on the tree, depending upon exactly where it turns out that we want to path in the 3.14 tree. However, if you do this, you will pick up Primordial Bond as an option. And this is actually a really good node. So it's going to give you 10% increased damage per summoned golem, which is really good, given that we're going to have a lot of golems. And it's going to give you 40% increased effect of buffs granted by your golems. So there's a big payoff if you go down this route, and I certainly think it's worth considering, but you are still using a large cluster jewel that will be pretty disappointing other than that one amazing node on it. So I'll leave that decision to be made once we actually get the full 3.14 patch notes and we know the exact layout of the new passive tree, but it's something at least that I think is worthwhile considering. Now, next up we have small cluster jewels, which have lots of defensive power. These should be considered seriously, especially given that you can craft them using the Powerhouse imprint base. But I think that this is something that we're just going to need to play around with in-game, get a bit of a sense as to how the Ultimatum League mechanics feel, and whether we want to be more defensive or more offensive in them. And this is something I don't think we can really answer yet, whether we want to use small cluster jewels. That said, I am pretty disappointed with the generic jewels. So the classic jewels, your Cobalt jewels, Viridian jewels, and Crimson jewels don't really offer anything amazing for this build. And so I'd be inclined to at least consider going down the small cluster jewel route and getting quite a bit of tankiness there, perhaps at the expense of then unspecking some other life nodes on your passive tree. So next up, let's talk about the golem setup. So as an elementalist, you will have 3 baseline golems. So that's one just that any character in Path of Exile can summon, plus 1 from taking Liege of the Primordial and 1 for taking Allomancer. So that's 3. There's a node on the passive tree called Golem Commander that gives you an extra 1, so that's 4. There's a unique item called the Anima Stone, which will give you 1 or 2, depending upon the number of jewels on your passive tree that you are willing to allocate to the Anima Stone. So if you're willing to sacrifice 2 additional jewel slots to empowering your golems further, then the Anima Stone can give you an additional 2 golems. The Anima Stone is pretty rare and expensive at the start of a league, so do keep that in mind. It's not going to be something that you can pick up for less than an Exalted Orb in the first week of a new league normally. And it can get more than that too. It wouldn't surprise me if the Anima Stone is 3 or 4 Exalted Orbs early in the league. Next after that, there is the unique item, the Primordial Chain. This comes at a high opportunity cost because it takes up your necklace slot. So that's a big cost. You cannot have non-golem minions. That's not a big deal. But you get +3 to your maximum number of golems. Your golems deal less damage and have less life, so they're a bit squishier. But as an elementalist, you're not really all that devastated when your golems die because they resummon themselves. And then your golems get increased movement speed. And the fact that it's primordial means that it can assist you in turning on the Anima Stone. So here's the Anima Stone. If you have 3 primordial items socketed or equipped, which means the Primordial Chain plus 2 more, then you get your second golem from the Anima Stone. The other primordial items are all jewels, and they're all jewels that wouldn't do a huge amount for this build. So it's definitely something that can be a little bit tricky to get your hands on. Lastly, the Primordial Chain is a League exclusive item. Now, these are all being changed in 3.14, and this might make the Primordial Chain quite a bit rarer or more common. And we really don't know yet. We're just going to have to find out how hard this item is to pick up in the new state of the game. We're just going to have to find that out. I can't give you an answer on that now. I'm pretty confident that even if it is 5 exalts, I can pick it up. So if I do decide to League start with this build, I'm fine with that. But you should keep that in mind. The Primordial Chain is a fairly big part of the power of this build, and it will hurt if you can't take it. Anyways, at this point we're looking at 8 or 9 golems total. So the 9th one has the high cost because you need to have the Anima Stone plus 2 additional primordial jewels. Assuming that we actually end up going with 8 golems, we're going to get 200% increased generic damage from Liege of the Primordial. Now this is not going to be 100% uptime. Actually, let's just bring this up. Liege of the Primordial here. As you can see, 25% increased damage per summoned golem, 25% increased effective buffs granted by your golems per summoned golem, and summon golems are resummoned 4 seconds after dying, and +1 to the number of +1 to the maximum number of summoned golems. This is a very powerful node in the Elementalist tree. So this is going to give you 200% generic damage while you have 8 golems active. That's huge. And it's also going to give you 200% increased effective buffs, and then Allomancer is going to give you another 200% increased effect of buffs. So this means that you're going to have 400% increased buff effect from all of your golems. You won't have this 100% uptime again, but in practice it'll be pretty high. So now we're starting to talk about the buff effect on golems, and let's just go and quickly bring up what the Flame Golem does, because I think that's one of the key things here that we have that makes for a big push towards building this way. Flame Golem is interesting. Golems grant 15 to 20% increased damage is what it reads. That doesn't sound like much, but, big but on this one. If you can get the gem level to 27, which is pretty achievable, then you are looking at getting 22% increased damage, which is then you're getting, from Allomancer, you're getting an extra 400% effect of that. So that is going to be 110% increased generic damage. You're also going to stack a few other sources of buff effect, and the ultimate effect is that you're going to get 166% increased damage from your Flame Golem at a pretty medium level of investment. So this requires level 27 on your Flame Golem, which is actually more accessible than it sounds. But even if you don't quite get there, you're still going to get most of that if you've got a, say, level 22 Flame Golem, which is something that you can access much, much earlier in your character's progression. So this is going to be a big source of additional damage for your character, and it's going to scale both the hit aspect of Reap and also the damage over time aspect. But it's not just the Flame Golem we're going to get, we're also going to get the Chaos Golem. Chaos Golem grants, at level 22, gem level 22, grants 5% physical damage reduction to your character. Now, with something like 500% increased effect of this, you're getting something like a massive 30% physical damage reduction. This is like having 7 endurance charges on your character. That's a lot. That's going to help keep your character alive from a lot of damage. You will also get Stone Golem, again at about 500% increased, effect of Stone Golem's buff. Stone Golem at gem level 20 recovers 105 life per second for your character. So when you've got 500% increased effect, that's 630 life recovery per second. That again is a lot. And the idea here is that you want this to be the primary way that you are funding the casting of the skill Reap. So you're going to be using ultimately a 6-link Reap, so it's going to cost quite a lot of life every time you cast it. Remember that Reap doesn't have a mana cost, it has a life cost instead. So you will end up spending a lot of life on that, but with 600 life recovery a second, I think you'll be alright. If you're not, then there's a number of other ways that we can scale up life recovery further. You could use an Elder influenced belt that has a life recovery mod on it, and that can then, in conjunction with Fertile Catalyst, that can give you 24% increased effect of all your life recovery. That includes your flasks, that includes life leech if you have any, but most importantly, it's going to include the life recovery that you're getting just by virtue of your Stone Golem's buff. So that should be enough to hopefully cover everything. You'll also get a little bit of cast speed from the Lightning Golem and critical strike chance from the Ice Golem, which will also help you. It will also help you out. You won't be wanting to build around critical strikes, I don't think. Critical strikes don't appear to scale Reap's damage over time; they just scale hit. But the incidental critical strikes that you get might make the shock node on the Elementalist compelling. And so let's just quickly jump over to that shock node, just to do a quick reminder of what it was. And I think I've just closed my, let's just go back to the Elementalist. So the shock node is called the Shaper of Storms. Your hits always shock, all damage with your hits can shock, and so that means the physical damage that you're inflicting with because normally physical damage doesn't have any ability to shock, but the physical damage from the hit component of your Reap will be able to shock, and actually will always shock, and shocks from your hits always increase damage taken by at least 15%. This is going to mean that this effect which is going to be probably the last node that you'll take on the Elementalist. You'll take Liege of the Primordial first, Allomancer second, and then just take the defensive Bastion of Elements third. At least that's what I believe you want to do, but of course feel free to mess around with other options. This should then put you in a strong position to scale up the damage from Reap quite a lot. So the breakpoints on Flame Golem, you get 20% baseline at gem level 19, 21% at gem level 23, which is pretty easy to get. All you need is a helmet that has +3 to the level of socketed minion gems, or +2 on a helmet and a level 21 gem. And then to get 22% from Flame Golem, you need gem level 27, which takes a bit more messing around. It's still doable, but it's something that you probably shouldn't expect to get to unless you play for quite a while during the league. Like, that's the sort of thing that you might do after you're already capable of beating Cirrus at Awakening level 8. And 23% is pretty much in the meme territory. Now, next up is Cruelty Support. Cruelty Support is something that, again, sorry about the low quality image here, but Cruelty Support appears to be a very viable option here for scaling up the damage on the Reap skill. So what Cruelty will do is two things. Firstly, it will cause Reap to deal 20% more damage with hits at gem level 1. Now, I'm kind of hoping that at gem level 20, this becomes 39% more, and that at gem level 21, it's 40% more. If that's the case, if it scales up strongly like that, then I think that this is going to be a good gem. If it scales up slower than that, then maybe it's not so great. Then there's this increased effect of Cruelty. Cruelty scales up damage over time that monsters suffer. We don't have any hard information on exactly how it's going to work. I'm just going to assume that it's fairly good, and we're just going to have to see the numbers on it. But it seems pretty good, and I think it's probably better than Empower, which is the alternative gem that I would be considering linking to Reap as an alternative. Next up, we have the question of auras. I'm inclined to go with Malevolence as the best aura, and scale some aura effect if possible to do so cheaply, which again is going to be something we're going to have to wait until the Balanced Manifesto patch notes and the 3.14 passive tree are out. Vitality is a possibility. I think we want to consider Petrified Blood, but I don't think we want to use it. Petrified Blood is one of the new skills that's being added, and it's designed for low life characters. I do think it's potentially very good, but it's something that we want to just play around with and see if it works. It is very good, though, with the Stone Golem and Golem effect that this character has. Pride is an option. I don't think it's worth its reservation cost, but I do think we should consider it. And again, once we get hard numbers, we'll consider that. Flesh and Stone in Blood Stance with Anomalous Maim is I think it's a 29% mana reservation that gives a lot of power, 30% increased damage taken. Now this scales linearly with shocks. So if you have a 17% magnitude shock on an enemy, then this is not 30% as one layer of 30% and then a 17% more multiplier on that. Instead, they just add together to 47%, and that scales the damage that the monster takes. That said, it's still very, very, very good. Ultimately, I think that Flesh and Stone in Blood Stance linked to Anomalous Maim offers more than the Pride Aura does, once you consider them as an entire package, and ultimately these two compete with each other. Lastly, we have Warbanner, which is a very cheap reservation that will provide even more increased damage. So if I just bring up Warbanner here, is at gem level 20, nearby enemies take 11% increased physical damage. And again, I believe that this is in the same shock layer, so it's just an additional source of damage. And then here's Maim support, causes enemies maimed by supported skills take 14% increased physical damage, which links to Flesh and Stone, which causes nearby enemies to be maimed while you're in Blood Stance and take an extra 16% increased phys damage. So that's the Flesh and Stone and Maim interaction. Again, that adds 30%. I've got the wrong gem there. These two together add 30% increased damage into this shock layer. And so lots of ways to scale that damage there. So in terms of support gems, here's where I think we're going to go for the moment. We're going to start with Cruelty support. Then we're going to add Brutality support. Brutality support is all about doing physical damage. So supported skills deal 40 to 59% more physical damage. That's a massive multiplier. Supported skills deal no elemental damage and no chaos damage. This is just really, really good. Of note, none of the alternate qualities are worth considering. You definitely want to upgrade this to an Awakened Brutality support if and when you are able to afford that, but Awakened Brutality will be a very, very much an endgame option. The next support gem to consider is Efficacy support. Efficacy support is probably not good enough, but I just want to mention it here as an option because it will increase the duration of your physical damage over time, as well as increasing the magnitude of it. But that said, I just think the numbers on it are too bad. We have Concentrated Effect. Concentrated Effect causes you to do a lot more damage in a small area. And so this is Controlled Destruction. Let's just quickly bring up Concentrated Effect as well, just so you can see the numbers on it. These two gems get used a lot together on spellcasters. 54% more area damage. And I believe that this will also increase the physical damage AoE. We need to test this out. If it turns out that it doesn't increase the damage over time component of Reap, then we're definitely going to drop this skill. The alternative is Spell Cascade or Awaken Spell Cascade, which sort of goes at opposite effects to Concentrated Effect, where Concentrated Effect is about projecting damage more tightly but doing more of it. The alternative of Awaken Spell Cascade causes you to do less damage but to do it over more enemies. Ultimately, I think for heavy bossing, you're probably going to want Concentrated Effect, and for softer bosses, and such as map bosses, and also for trash monsters, you're probably going to want to use Awaken Spell Cascade if you can afford it, or normal Spell Cascade, or increased area of effect if you can't. We have Controlled Destruction next, which causes supported skills to deal 44 or 45% more spell damage, which, because of Reap's mechanics, will also scale the damage over time component. It causes your skills to have 100% reduced critical strike chance. This basically undoes some of the benefits that you're getting from your Ice Golem, but it's much less impactful than it sounds. We're not really trying to scale critical strikes though, so Controlled Destruction's penalty is just not all that important. Lastly, we want to consider Life Tap once numbers are known, compare it to Efficacy as it may well be better, and we also want to consider Empower support. All of these could be contenders for the last slot. What's really interesting here is that we have something that is all red and blue with no green. It is very rare to have a situation where a character's 6-link has 0 green gems in it, and this may mean that there's a lot of possibility to pick up a well-corrupted Skin of the Loyal. Skin of the Loyal is a unique chess piece that is always 6-linked, and the colors of the sockets cannot ever be changed. It has +1 to the level of all socketed gems, and it also has a couple of other effects, but it can be corrupted to sometimes have +2 to the level of 2 different classes of gems. If you can get one of those that's really well corrupted and has the right colors on it, then it could be an extraordinarily high damage piece of equipment. Other options that I think you should consider in terms of scaling damage. Punishment and Vulnerability are 2 curses that look so good on this build. So Punishment is a curse that was terrible for the longest time imaginable, and it got a complete rework recently and is now quite solid. So when you kill an enemy that's got punishment on it, the overkill damage that you do, 10% of that is inflicted on other nearby enemies. That's not the reason we're using this though. The reason we're using this is that cursed enemies take a huge amount of increased damage while on low life. This is again in that shock layer, so this scales linearly with effects like shock, the Pride Aura, and the like. Very powerful effect there. And additionally, there's a few other little effects on this. Punishment, we definitely want to use. Additionally, we have Vulnerability Curse, which I will bring up now. Vulnerability, that's down here somewhere. It's in the reds. So Vulnerability causes enemies to take increased physical damage. This is good. Lastly, we have Despair Curse. Despair causes enemies to take increased damage over time increased damage from damage over time effects. All of these curses are good, and my solution for how many of them you can realistically apply to an enemy comes down to the following. we want to get some sort of automated cursing of both punishment and vulnerability. The way that we would do this is at a reasonably high budget. You might use Void Sphere as your way of inflicting these, just because I like Void Sphere a lot as a secondary sort of support skill. Linking it to Awakened Hex Touch support once you can afford that, or just linking it to Hex Touch. So Void Sphere linked to Hex Touch, normal Hex Touch, plus punishment, plus vulnerability, and then using an anointment on your amulet to anoint the +1 extra curse node. Alternately, you could use vulnerability on hit on gloves as a corruption. Third curse, if you can fit one in, will be Despair. And the way that you would get all three curses is by using Awakened Hex Touch and also giving up your anointment. I do think that this is viable. You would then have a Awakened Hex Touch linked to some skill, like Void Sphere is the way that I'd be doing it, but you can feel free to use something else. Void Sphere linked to Awakened Hex Touch, linked to Punishment and to Despair, and then having vulnerability on hit corrupted onto your gloves, and having an anointment dedicated to +1 curse. Awakened Hex Touch lets you inflict one more curse than your normal curse limit on enemies, and so that'll give you your 3 curses. This is really strong as a high-end setup, but don't worry about it until you get to that point. In terms of other gear options that you want to consider, for weapons, you're going to want to start the game with Cold Iron Point. Not that you can start the game with Cold Iron Point. You're going to want to pick up Cold Iron Point as soon as you can. Cold Iron Point is a unique item that I have done a sort of in-depth analysis on. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. But it is a very simple dagger. It has the stats, you cannot deal elemental damage, and +3 to the level of all physical spell skills. So this is really strong. This is going to increase Reap's level by 3 because it is physical and it is a spell. So that's going to massively increase the amount of damage that you do, especially as you dual wield this weapon. That's the way you want to start out endgame. Cold Iron Point can be like a 50 chaos item early in a league. It's not that rare. In fact, it's pretty common and it drops anywhere, but it's something that's often in very high demand early in the league. However, the later that you get to endgame, the less you're going to need to grind in order to pick up 2 of these things, and they'll serve you really well for a while. Ultimately, though, the later game weapons that you're going to want to use are to start out with a wand that has a high percentage increased physical damage implicit. A high percentage increased spell damage implicit. And then you're going to want to get as many great prefixes as you can afford. Magisters, which is +1 to the level of all spell skill gems. Physical dot multi if it's available on wands, which we're going to have to find out. It does appear to be in the Veiled mod system, so again, we're just going to have to see what's available there. The Lithomancer's mod, which is +1 to the level of all physical spell skill gems, and then Runic or Glyphic, which are the mods that increase spell damage by the largest amount. Once you've got these 3, once you've got as many great prefixes as you can afford, you're going to want to apply a Hunter's Exalted Orb to your item, and then use the Harvest Reforge keeping prefixes until you get increased Malevolence effect. There are other ways you can do this as well. You might want to use the 2 Exalted Orb, bench craft that says prefixes cannot be changed, and then use the Harvest Reforge with this Reforge an item with 1 influence mod and influence items being more common. Lots of options you can do there, and time will tell which of these is the best options. In terms of other gems that you might want to use, Corrupting Fever is worth considering. I think we want to use this unless it's terrible, but we don't have any numbers on it yet, so it might just be terrible. Chest piece, early league, I think you want to use Carcass Jack, or just generic defense items like Belly of the Beast. Later on, if the Explodey chest is not nerfed, I think a lot of people are expecting it to get nerfed in 3.14, but if it dodges a nerf bat, then there's no question. You have to use an Explodey chest. It's the best thing in the game. Boots-wise, you want life, resist, move speed, and tailwind if you can afford it. Rings, you want to have, you probably want to have 1 or more recover life on spell hit mods. Otherwise, this is somewhere that you can just fill out a lot of issues with your gear. I don't think there's that many good options for increasing the amount of damage your character does on rings, so you're probably just going to want to get a lot of defensive stats here. Helmet, you're probably going to want +3 to the level of socketed minions and a Flame Golem enchant. You may end up finding that Flame Golem's not the enchant you want. It may be that there's more that's available from the Reap enchants. We don't know what they're going to be yet. But for now, I would say +3 to the level of socketed minions on a helmet with a Flame Golem enchant is going to be your sort of early endgame goal. And then later on, you can potentially look to upgrade it to something better. And then for gloves, whatever can be managed with the curses you want. So that's my initial thoughts on how I'd start building around Reap. Once more, this is a theory crafting session. This is not a full build guide, but I will endeavor that once we get the full stats, I will try to put out something that is more of a build guide. Very important reminder though, if you are intending to league start a brand new skill, make sure you have a backup plan. Make sure that you've already worked out what you're going to change to if it turns out that Reap is mediocre, or worse, if it turns out the Reap is terrible. Make sure that you are confident with your ability to save enough regret orbs that you can make that respec yourself, especially if you're playing in solo self-found. And if you do need more regret orbs, they do tend to drop a lot in low depth delving. So you'll find a lot of them there, especially if you break open fractured walls. Anyways, that's all I've got at the moment. If you've got any comments or questions, definitely fire away below. Otherwise, I will continue my coverage of 3.14. Hopefully there'll be a lot of teasers that come out during the next week. GGG have been very, very, very quiet on the production of teasers so far. So all we've had really has been the initial information that came out with the Ultimatum League trailer and the discussion that followed with the developer discussion after that. There's been no divination cards. I still don't even know if my divination card is going to be in 3.14 or if it's been held off to 3.15. And so we're just going to find all of that information out probably over the next week. We'll get the Zana mods, all that sort of stuff. So there'll be a lot of activity on this channel.